You're listening to the Naked Bible Podcast. To support this podcast, go to nakedbiblepodcast.com and click on the support link in the upper right-hand corner. If you're new to the podcast and Dr. Heiser's approach to the Bible, click on New Start Here at nakedbiblepodcast.com.
Welcome to the Naked Bible Podcast, episode 466, 1 Samuel 18. I'm the layman, Trey Strickland, and he's the scholar, Dr. Justin Bass. Hey, Justin, how are you?
Hey, Trey. Doing well.
Good.
How are you doing, sir?
I'm doing pretty good. Anything new to report since chapter 17?
I saw John Wick 4.
Oh,
Have
okay.
to bring that up.
Good or bad?
Remember, I'm a big movie lover, and I loved it. Yeah.
Okay, good.
Now he'll even get a reference in this discussion of 1 Samuel 18. I don't know how that happened, but
well, I was going to.
But it's full of art.
Yeah.
You know, even if anybody in the audience struggles with the violence, it's so comic bookish type violence. So I just see it not as that big a deal. But you know, if you don't want to see a bunch of 1,000 people get shot in the head, then don't see it. But there's beautiful art. They film a lot of the movie in the Louvre in France, and it's just beautiful. And it's amazing because they're strategically placed Christian paintings all throughout. So I'm my friend and I who saw it, we're convinced that whoever made that movie has to be at least a closet believer or trying to put things out there to lift up Christ, because it was some beautiful paintings in the background. So I recommend it to those who usually watch violent action films.
Okay, which will be me. I'm included in that. I'm a child of the 80s, so
yes.
Mike didn't like I made a slasher reference because I grew up with all the slasher movies, Friday 13th, in the 80s, and I don't think he liked that because I said, "What does that say about me?"
Yeah.
And he said, "I don't know, not nothing good."
Well, I grew up with him too, but I'm convinced that there was evil. There's definitely evil behind, especially a lot of those 80s horror movies. a lot of evil in those for sure.
If anything, watching those types of movies only reinforced that evil is real for me as a child.
Exactly.
So, all those scary movies in the 80s and stuff, I just grew up believing in the supernatural. So it just reinforced my supernatural worldview. That's what the movies did, strengthen that view.
And one good thing about the older ones is that they pretty consistently would always have the good overcoming the evil. It's like it's more the recent horror type movies. They try to really turn it upside down and make evil win. And that's why my wife and I, we really don't even watch any modern horror movies, but I've read about them, and it seems that they want to make the cross not powerful, the priest loses, that kind of thing. Rather, when the older movies, it was always the priest would have the power, the cross had power over the vampire or whatever it was, So at least you had that in the older horror movies. Yeah,
I have not watched any modern day horror movies since having kids, and my wife doesn't like it. I am not able to catch those as much, but I hate to hear that because I think there's some good lessons to be learned in horror movies sometimes, especially when the priests win, right?
I agree. I agree. In fact, I'll plug The Stand. The Stand by Stephen King's book, The Stand. It's kind of his version of The End of the World.
Yeah.
And the older one, the one from the 90s, there was a series. I think it went on for like 4 different nights, and it was because it was made for TV. It was scary, but it didn't have any sex or violence, or it had a little bit of violence, but no sex and no language because it was made for TV. And so I highly recommend, because I think there's such great things to learn from that series, from the original The Stand.
I agree. It was good. And they just redid it recently, like a few years ago, didn't they?
They redid it. And we did watch that one, but I'll just say that because they redid it, I can't remember which streaming service, but man, it's a full blown R-rated, a lot of terrible things in it. So it's not good for the eyes, that one, the new one. That's why I would recommend the old one, because I think the old one gives you all the great virtuous things and really grounded in the Bible things. When the new one, you have to really sift through a lot of manure to get to the gems.
All right. Well, I am interested to see how you work in John Wick with Samuel 18. So it's all you.
Thank you, sir. Well, let me begin with a brief bio of this unsung hero of the Bible, Jonathan. You don't hear enough about Jonathan. This is no doubt because his story is told in the shadow of the great King David. But as Charles Spurgeon said in a sermon, Jonathan is a wonderfully noble, lovable, magnanimous man that was heir to the throne of Israel. He is magnanimous for many reasons, but the greatest act of all is the fact that Jonathan voluntarily hands over his throne to David. Not only was he heir to the throne of Israel, being the son of the king, he was at least a decade or more older than David. Before David was born, or as we might say today, while David was still breastfeeding, Jonathan was already leading thousands of soldiers to battle, as recorded in 1 Samuel 13, where Jonathan first appears in the Bible. It's also clear from 1 Samuel 13 and 14 that he's an elite, brave, and courageous warrior who wholeheartedly trusts in Yahweh. I love the story in 1 Samuel 14 where Jonathan and his armor bearer take on over 20 Philistines by themselves and kills them all. Every time I read it, I visualize that great scene in The Patriot when Mel Gibson and his young son take on around 20 redcoats to save his oldest son. Another great movie. Listen to what Jonathan says to his armor bearer. This is from 1 Samuel 14, verse 6. "Come, let us go over to the garrison of these uncircumcised. It may be that the Lord will work for us, for nothing can hinder the Lord from saving by many or by few." This sounds a lot like someone else, the young David, as he went to battle with Goliath. Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, since he has taunted the armies of the living God. Jonathan and David are kindred spirits indeed. It makes sense then that when Jonathan first meets David, holding Goliath's head in his hands, and having seen his courageous deed of slaying the giant, as 1 Samuel 18 verse 1 says, his soul was knit to the soul of David. And this echoes the language, by the way, of Jacob's deep love for his son, Benjamin, in Genesis 44. Their souls were bundled up together. C.S. Lewis captures this kind of friendship in his great book, The Four Loves. He says, "Friendship arises when two or more of the companions discover that they have in common some insight or interest or even taste that the others do not share, and that till that moment, each believed to be his own unique treasure or burden. The typical expression of opening friendship would be something like, 'What? You too? I thought I was the only one.' What united them, what united Jonathan and David, was not only killing uncircumcised Philistines, but their love and trust in Yahweh." Let's read the first 4 verses of chapter 18. "Now it came about when he had finished speaking to Saul." Note that this is continuing the story of David and Goliath from chapter 17. Remember, there were no chapter breaks in the original text, so this is a good example where the chapter break really breaks the continuity of the story. "That the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as himself. Saul took him that day and did not let him return to his father's house. Then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him and gave it to David with his armor, including his sword and his bow and his belt. Jonathan, the son of the king, a mighty warrior, gave this young shepherd boy his royal robe, his armor, his sword, bow, and belt. This was symbolic for a voluntary giving up of power, of kingship on Jonathan's part, and transferring it to David. Long before the legendary figure of Roman virtue, Cincinnatus, gave up his power and returned to his farm, and long before George Washington, the legendary figure of American virtue, gave up his power and refused to make America a monarchy, Jonathan gave up his power to David. Who else did this in the Bible, or really in all of history? Besides those three, only one person in the Bible and all of history has given up absolute power, supreme power of the heavens and the earth, by humbling himself, becoming a man, suffering to the point of death, even death on a cross. Jonathan is magnanimous here, and Cincinnatus and Washington, because their surrender of power points to the greatest surrender of power in Jesus Christ. Jonathan will continue in this resolve, in his love and loyalty for David to his death. His last recorded words in 1 Samuel 23, 16 through 18 make this clear. "And Jonathan, Saul's son, arose and went to David at Horesh and encouraged him in God. Thus Jonathan said to him, 'Do not be afraid. because the hand of Saul my father will not find you, and you will be king over Israel, and I will be next to you. And Saul my father knows that also. So the two of them made a covenant before the Lord, and David stayed at Horish while Jonathan went to his house. You will be king, and I will be next to you. When you know the whole story, that kind of gives you a tear. But an incredible statement by Jonathan. Jonathan will die fighting God's enemies, the Philistines, with King Saul and his brothers at the end of 1 Samuel. But unlike Saul, Jonathan dies in Yahweh's favor. We see this clearly in 2 Samuel when David shows compassion to Jonathan's disabled son, Mephibosheth. And if you look at the genealogies in 1 Chronicles, Mephibosheth has a rich line of descendants, the only surviving descendants of Saul. Like I said, don't skip over Jonathan. Lots of treasures and wisdom to be learned from him. Let's now hear more about the other magnanimous man, David. This is 1 Samuel 18, 5-9. So David went out wherever Saul sent him and prospered. And Saul set him over the men of war. And it was pleasing in the sight of all the people, and also in the sight of Saul's servants. It happened as they were coming, when David returned from killing the Philistine, that the women came out of all the cities of Israel singing and dancing to meet King Saul with tambourines, with joy, and with musical instruments. The women sang as they played and said, Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s. Then Saul became very angry, for this saying displeased him. And he said, They have ascribed to David 10,000s, but to me they have ascribed thousands. Now what more can he have but the kingdom? Saul looked at David with suspicion from that day on. Saul has slain his thousands, David his 10,000s, and John Wick his hundreds of thousands. No, David might have killed more than John Wick. I think Samson definitely killed more than John Wick. But David had only actually killed Goliath at this point. But in killing Goliath, in that one-on-one combat, David gets the credit for killing all the Philistines that day. And I think rightly so. King Saul isn't a fan of the song and immediately turns a jealous eye to David and really never turns it away after this. Some of my favorite visual illustrations of the deadly sin of envy would come from the excellent films Amadeus and the Count of Monte Cristo, and of course Shakespeare's play Othello. And like Saul, the envious characters in all those stories ultimately are destroyed by their own envy, suspicion, hatred, and increasing jealousy. Pretty clear pro tip from the scriptures here. Don't have a jealous eye. Do not participate even for a moment in envy. Don't be like Saul. Immediately repent of it and turn your eyes to Christ. It will only lead to the same kind of death and destruction of Saul. Never compare yourself with other people. Compare yourself instead with who you were yesterday, or who you were 5 years ago or 10 years ago. Another reason to not engage in the deadly sins of envy and wrath or anger is, as Paul says, it gives Satan a foothold. Literally in the Greek, a space to take hold of you. And this is what happens to Saul. 1 Samuel 18, 10-11. Now it came about on the next day that an evil spirit from God came mightily upon Saul. And he raved in the midst of the house while David was playing the harp with his hand as usual. And a spear was in Saul's hand. Saul hurled the spear, for he thought, I will pin David to the wall. But David escaped from his presence twice. Saul's rejecting of God's word, his absence of prayer, and his giving himself over to envy, hatred, and anger leads to his possession by a demon. The evil spirit coming upon Saul makes me think of Wormtongue in Lord of the Rings, speaking into King Theoden's ear. This evil spirit or demon coming from Yahweh no doubt refers to the counsel of Yahweh, as seen by the prophet Micaiah in 1 Kings 22. I think we should assume a similar background to this evil spirit being sent directly from the counsel of Yahweh to torment Saul, just like the evil spirit was sent to be a lying spirit in the mouths of King Ahab's false prophets. Remember, God is sovereign over all, good and evil. This is not Star Wars. This is reality. God is in the heavens and he does whatever pleases him. The contrast couldn't be more clear. Yahweh is with David, and demons are with Saul. And the storytelling here really is masterful, because notice that Saul tries to pin David with a spear multiple times. Later in the story, a spear will be right next to Saul while he's in a deep sleep. And Abishai, David's main bodyguard, says to David, "Let me strike him with the spear to the ground with one stroke. I will not strike him a second time." I love Abishai, by the way. You need to find, even pray for a friend like Abishai and Jonathan, if you don't have one. And David refuses to kill Saul. He says, "No, Abishai." David is also magnanimous because he is Christ-like, showing undeserved love to his enemies. Even in this story, David is holding a heart to heal, while Saul holds a spear in order to kill. Proverbs 29, verse 10, chapter 29, verse 10 captures this contrast between Saul and David. Men of bloodshed hate the blameless, but the upright are concerned for his life. Let's continue reading. 1 Samuel 18, 12 through 16. Now Saul was afraid of David, for the Lord was with him, but had departed from Saul. Therefore Saul removed him from his presence and appointed him as his commander of 1,000. And he went out and came in before the people. David was prospering in all his ways, for the Lord was with him. When Saul saw that he was prospering greatly, he dreaded him. But all Israel and Judah loved David, and he went out and came in before them. Everyone loves David. Jonathan loves David at the beginning of the chapter. Here we have all Israel and Judah love David. And later, the text says Saul's daughter, Michal, loves David. And in fact, a few chapters ago in 1 Samuel 16, it said Saul loved David. The reason for this is clear. Yahweh was with him. Then Saul said to David, "Here is my older daughter, Merab. I will give her to you as a wife. Only be a valiant man for me and fight the Lord's battles." That's rich coming from Saul. I believe David is the one fighting the Lord's battles. For Saul thought, "My hand shall not be against him, but let the hand of the Philistines be against him." Remember, Saul had already promised David his daughter in marriage for killing Goliath. He at least seems to be making good on that promise here, but the text tells us Saul's true motives. But David said to Saul, "Who am I, and what is my life or my father's family in Israel, that I should be the king's son-in-law?" So it came about at the time when Merab, Saul's daughter, should have been given to David, that she was given to Adriel, the Meholathite, for a wife. I think the author of Samuel wants us to see true humility on David's part here. Saul was actually humble once, before he became a murderous maniac. David will turn to evil when he is king as well, but the key difference between him and Saul is true heartfelt repentance. David has it, Saul does not. I like Matthew Henry's comments on this passage. Who am I, and what is my life? Note, it well becomes us, however God has advanced us, always to have low thoughts of ourselves. He that humbles himself shall be exalted. And if David thus magnified the honor of being son-in-law to the king, how should we magnify the honor of being sons, not in law but in gospel, to the King of Kings? Behold, what manner of love the Father has bestowed upon us. Who are we that we should be thus dignified? Who are we indeed? Continue reading. Now Michal, Saul's daughter, loved David. When they told Saul the thing was agreeable to him, Saul thought, I will give her to him, that she may become a snare to him, and that the hand of the Philistines may be against him. Therefore Saul said to David, For a second time you may be my son-in-law today. Then Saul commanded his servants, Speak to David secretly, saying, Behold, the king delights in you, and all his servants love you. Now therefore become the king's son-in-law. So Saul's servants spoke these words to David. But David said, Is it trivial in your sight to become the king's son-in-law, since I am a poor man and lightly esteemed? Note again the humility. The servants of Saul reported to him according to these words which David spoke. Saul then said, Thus you shall say to David, The king does not desire any dowry except 100 foreskins of the Philistines to take vengeance on the king's enemies. Now Saul planned to make David fall by the hand of the Philistines. When his servants told David these words, it pleased David to become the king's son-in-law. Before the days had expired, David rose up and went, he and his men, and struck down 200 men among the Philistines. Then David brought their foreskins, and they gave them in full number to the king, that he might become the king's son-in-law. So Saul gave him Michal, his daughter, for a wife. Incredible that Saul tries to get David killed the same way David will later have Bathsheba's husband Uriah killed. Saul intended Michal to be the bait, and this Herculean labor of bringing back 100 foreskins as the trap. Robert Chisholm, in his commentary on 1 Samuel, says, "It was common in the ancient Near East for victors to remove the heads, hands, and even genitals of their victims for the sake of casualty counts or as trophies of war. You don't hear about the retrieving of foreskins that often, though. This seems to be a truly sadistic challenge from the disturbed mind of Saul. The Jewish historian Josephus was even embarrassed by this because he changes the story to say that David brought back 600 heads instead of hundreds of foreskins. In order to achieve this feat, David would have, of course, had to kill 100 Philistines. No matter how good he was at negotiating, there is no way he's getting their foreskins while they are still alive. In true Davidic fashion, he brings back double the amount, meaning he killed 200 Philistines. And he did it long before the deadline, Saul said. You can see why Saul was terrified of David. The last few verses of 1 Samuel 18. When Saul saw and knew that the Lord was with David and that Michal, Saul's daughter, loved him, then Saul was even more afraid of David. Thus Saul was David's enemy continually. Then the commanders of the Philistines went out to battle, and it happened as often as they went out that David behaved himself more wisely than all the servants of Saul. So his name was highly esteemed. I think 2 Samuel chapter 3, verse 1 captures the heart of these last few chapters from 1 Samuel 15 to chapter 18. It says, David grew steadily stronger, but the house of Saul grew weaker continually. David grew stronger, and Saul grew weaker. Saul will fall, and David will be king, and there is nothing Saul or anyone else can do about that, for Yahweh is with him. When you read the early church fathers, you find that they regularly see in these stories of Saul and David the future persecution of Christians by kings in power, namely the Caesars of Rome. Charles Spurgeon in 19th century London was still reading it this way, and I think it's a good application. Spurgeon says, "Mark well that one of the ways by which your election will become clear and sure to all God's people will be this. If you are anointed king as David was before you, you will come into conflict with Saul. It cannot be possible that the chosen of God shall forever live in peace with the heirs of hell. He who put an enmity between the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent takes care that the old enmity shall never die. The two first men of woman born were enemies of one another for this reason. And until Christ shall come, that same enmity will exist. Saul may like you for a little time if you can play well upon an instrument and drive away his melancholy. But when Saul finds you out and discovers you to be the anointed king, he will hurl his javelin at you." Another key theme from this story that we find from Genesis to Revelation, and really throughout all of history, is what Joseph said to his brothers. "As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring about this present result, to preserve many people alive." From Genesis 50. What man and devils mean for evil, God has and will bring about for good. From Joseph's brothers to the Egyptian pharaohs, to Satan with Job, to Saul with David, to Haman with Mordecai, to the Caesars of Rome persecuting Christians, to tyrants today persecuting Christians all over the world, like in China. The martyr's blood is seed. God will bring good out of evil. The supreme example of this is the cross, where all evil did its worst to Jesus Christ, and the greatest good, the salvation of us in all things, invisible and visible, was accomplished. Saul couldn't stop David from being king, and nothing, no thing, not Satan, not all the power in all the universe, can stop Jesus from being King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Let me close with Psalm 25, possibly one of the Psalms David wrote, fleeing from Saul. David writes this: "Make me know your ways, O Lord. Teach me your paths. Lead me in your truth and teach me, for you are the God of my salvation. For you I wait all the day. Remember, O Lord, your compassion and your loving kindnesses, for they have been from of old. Do not remember the sins of my youth or my transgressions. According to your loving kindness, remember me, for your goodness' sake, O Lord. Remember, O Lord, your compassion and your loving kindnesses, for they have been from of old. Do not remember the sins of my youth or my transgressions. According to your loving kindness, remember me, for your goodness' sake, O Lord. Good and upright is the Lord. Therefore he instructs sinners in the way. He leads the humble in justice, and he teaches the humble his way. All the paths of the Lord are loving kindness and truth to those who keep his covenant and his testimonies. For your name's sake, O Lord, pardon my iniquity, for it is great. Who is the man who fears the Lord? He will instruct him in the way he should choose. His soul will abide in prosperity, and his descendants will inherit the land. The secret of the Lord is for those who fear him, and he will make them know his covenant. My eyes are continually toward the Lord, for he will pluck my feet out of the net. Turn to me and be gracious to me, for I am lonely and afflicted. The troubles of my heart are enlarged. Bring me out of my distresses. Look upon my affliction and my trouble, and forgive all my sins. Look upon my enemies, for they are many, and they hate me with a violent hatred. Saul. Guard my soul and deliver me. Do not let me be ashamed, for I take refuge in you. Let integrity and uprightness preserve me, for I wait for you. Redeem Israel, O God, out of all his troubles. Amen.
I would have loved to have heard Dr. Heiser talk about the taking of the foreskins. I mean, that's such a delicate thing to do. And of course, unless they just whacked it, but, chopped it off. But I would imagine delivering the foreskins, it's such a precise thing to do. I would imagine.
I can't imagine. Yeah. I can't imagine. I don't even want to imagine it. I just don't want to think about
it. Well, I can't help but think about it now. That image is in my head.
Philistines.
Yeah, I mean, 200, I can't get that image out of my head. So, that's pretty graphic stuff for the Bible. And, it is what it is. I mean, that's
why I always say Samuel, Judges, Samuel, and Kings is R-rated. I mean, if you were to present a lot of these stories in movie form, and if you were going to do it right, it'd have to be R-rated.
Yeah, and you've got to think about it. I mean, that's what we're doing right now. We're taking time to think about it. So, how brutal that is. And David was brutal. You got to think about it. All right, Justin, we appreciate it. We look forward to chapter 19 with you next time. And with that, I want to thank everybody else for listening to the Naked Bible Podcast. God bless.
Thanks for listening to the Naked Bible Podcast. To support this podcast, visit www.nakedbibleblog.com. To learn more about Dr. Heiser's other websites and blogs, go to www.drmsh.com.